Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 716 for July 29th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
When we were talking this morning, we couldn't agree on who produces the best whiskey. We couldn't agree on whether it's spelled W-H-I-S-K-E-Y or W-H-I-S-K-Y. But we did agree unanimously and soon in writing that open and fair trade is essential for the future of our global industry.
Leaders from the 9 major whiskey industry trade associations around the world gathered for the first time this week in Louisville to work out a common response to the global trade dispute. I was in Louisville for what's being called the W9 Summit, and we'll have a full report later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's coming up along with the calendar of events, your voice, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and Behind the Label. That's all ahead on this edition of WhiskyCast.
This is Whisky, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whisky, from this place and these people, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. And while we'll have more on the W9 Summit in just a few minutes, it's worth noting that there were a lot of smiles at the summit, which began just hours after U.S. President Donald Trump and European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker met at the White House on Wednesday. Trump had threatened ahead of that meeting to impose new tariffs on imported cars and auto parts, which could have taken the trade dispute to a new level. Instead, Trump and Juncker agreed to try and de-escalate the conflict. While the current round of tariffs will remain in effect for now, the two sides will keep talking with an eye to working out an agreement that could lead to an end to the conflict. Scotch Whisky Association CEO Karen Betts and her colleagues praised the decision to turn down the rhetoric.
Look, I think yesterday was clearly a very positive meeting, and it clearly has put a positive momentum behind trade talks between Europe and the US. And we now hope that those move forward to strengthen that really important trading relationship, and also to move everywhere further towards zero tariffs and zero non-tariff barriers.
Once again, we'll have more coverage from the summit in Louisville in a few minutes on WhiskyCast In-Depth. Meanwhile, the Brexit battle between the UK and the European Union is showing no signs of a so-called soft Brexit resolution next March, and that has Ireland's whiskey industry very nervous over the possibility of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. However, there was a bright spot for the industry. Lawmakers have approved legislation that loosens up some of the restrictions on Irish craft distillers and brewers. It'll allow them to sell directly to the public without requiring visitors to take a tour first, and extend their open hours as well. Eva Clark chairs the Irish Spirits Association.
What that now allows is our craft breweries and our craft distilleries more flexibility in terms of the experience that they can offer to consumers and to tourists when they come and visit. And what we're seeing in Ireland at this moment in time is a massive growth in whisky tourism, very similar to what has been seen here in Kentucky with the Kentucky Bourbon Trail.
The industry is still watching to see how the European Union rules on a public health bill being considered in the Dáil. That bill would require mandatory health warnings on all alcoholic beverages that go over and above current EU mandates. It also imposes new limits on retail displays and advertising.
We believe as we enter into the fall period that the public health bill will come back on the agenda. We're trying to work with all sides and all stakeholders to encourage reasonable and balanced measures and amendments to be made to that bill.
What do you need for it to be satisfactory to the industry?
There's a number of elements in it that we're actually very supportive of and have no problem with. But one of the big areas where we have severe concerns is the a warning label, which would require our products and any alcohol products in the market to be labelled as cancer causing. We feel that is the link between alcohol and cancer is a very complex one. It's not a straightforward one, and to say outright that alcohol causes cancer, full stop, is not an accurate statement.
The EU's review is expected to be completed by the end of September. Enough politics for now. Let's talk about new whiskies. It's been 4 years since Diageo relaunched its Mortlach single malt with 4 luxury expressions. While Mortlach has always been a cult favorite among Scotch whiskey lovers, those initial 4 expressions did not make a big impact on the single malt market. Now, 3 new Mortlach editions are being released. The 12-year-old Wee Witchy, which gets its name from one of the stills at Mortlach, along with a 16-year-old Distiller's Dram and the 20-year-old Cowie's Blue Seal, named for the Cowie family that owned Mortlach for many years. They'll sell in the U.S. at prices ranging from $50 for the 12-year-old to $200 a bottle for the 20-year-old. We'll have tasting notes for them soon at WhiskyCast.com. And while plans are well along for the revival of Diageo's Port Ellen distillery on Islay, there's a new Port Ellen edition in the Johnnie Walker Blue Label Ghost and Rare series. Master blender Jim Beveridge created it by taking Port Ellen single malt and whiskies from 2 other ghost distilleries, Carsbridge and Caledonian, and blending them with rare malts from Mortlach, Oban, Dalhousie, Cragganmore, and Blair Athol. It's a limited edition that will sell for around $350 a bottle. Meanwhile, Glenfiddich is releasing the latest edition in its experimental series. Fire and Cane is a cousin to the Balvenie's Peat Week editions, since both came from experiments with using peated barley at the 2 distilleries. Glenfiddich's Mitch Bouchard gave me a preview of it in New Orleans during Tales of the Cocktail.
What we've been doing since 2003 back at the distillery, just before close down, which is around about Christmas time, we produced around about 100,000 litres of very heavily peated Glenfiddich. So what we've done with Fire and Cane is we've taken some of that heavily peated liquid, blended it with unpeated Glenfiddich, and then finished it off in rum casks. So these are Latin rum casks that we've used.
What's the difference between the Grand Reserva and this one?
Well, I mean, firstly, it was different rum that we used to season the casks. So what Brian Kinsman found, the rum that we were using for the 21-year-old just didn't cut through enough. So we had to get a heavier style of rum just to cut through that phenol content coming in. So what people are going to find with this, for me, the Glenfiddich 21-year-old, you're going to get that nice, it's almost dark chocolate, it's coffee, espresso coffee comes through with it. This is definitely more of that sweetness, kind of a nice toffeed sweetness with Fire and Cane, but also this nice smokiness. And what I find as well, and what we're finding with a lot of people is, if you play about with this, you add water to it, you add ice to it, you're going to get different things every time. Maybe it's that sweetness that's coming through, or maybe it's the smokiness that's coming through.
It's the 4th release in Glenfiddich's experimental series, but this one will be the first to make its debut in the U.S., where it'll carry a recommended retail price of $49.99 a bottle. It'll eventually be available in other global markets. And, by the way, Mitch has been reassigned from his brand ambassador's role in the U.S. to a new position at the distillery in Scotland, and we wish him the best of luck. Highland Park is shaking up its travel retail range with 4 new whiskies, including a travel retail edition of its classic 18-year-old that's bottled at a stronger 46% ABV than the regular retail version. Spirit of the Bear is a no-age statement smoky malt using Orkney's native peat, while the 14-year-old Loyalty of the Wolf edition is a sweeter whiskey that uses a combination of sherry-seasoned and ex-bourbon casks. The 16-year-old Wings of the Eagle malt combines some of the flavors of the other 2 whiskeys. The new series will replace the current Warrior series of Sven, Harold, and Einar malts. They'll be available first in European travel retail shops, followed by Asia and the Middle East, and later this year in the Americas. I'll have more on this later on. Beam is putting more money into its Basil Hayden's brand these days. In addition to the Dark Rye Edition released earlier this year, there's a new 2x2 rye whiskey out now. It takes 2 different ryes and blends them with 2 different bourbons, thus the 2x2 name. The ryes are 5 and 7 years old, the bourbons 6 and 13 years old. The 2x2 rye will sell for around $45 a bottle. I'll have tasting notes for it soon at whiskycast.com. And finally, The Last Drop Distillers is releasing its latest single malt, and it's first from Speyside. They acquired 2 single casks of the Glenrothes single malt that were both filled on the same day, November 19th, 1968, about 4 casks apart. Both casks were bottled separately, with a total of 309 bottles available. They'll carry a recommended retail price of $6,250 each and will be available in extremely limited amounts worldwide. And by the way, The Last Drop has plans to release 2 more Glenrothes casks from 1969 and 1970. They'll be out in 2019 and 2020. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, and while you're waiting for those new travel retail releases to hit your favorite airport shop, look for Voyage of the Raven right now. It's a tribute to the ravens that guided Vikings on their voyages. After all, the Vikings did not have GPS. Get all of the details at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society's U.S. chapter has tastings on August 6th at the Shakespeare in New York City and August 20th at 55 South in San Jose, California. Whiskey Fringe 2018 is August 10th through the 12th in Edinburgh, Scotland. The Whiskey Show Melbourne is August 10th and 11th in Melbourne, Australia. And speaking of Australia, Tasmanian Whiskey Week is August 13th through the 19th. Bonhams and McTeers both have whiskey auctions coming up on the 17th. Bonhams will be in Hong Kong, and the McTeers auction will be in Glasgow, Scotland. Westport Whiskey and Wine in Louisville, Kentucky will hold a Stave and Thief Society Certified Bourbon Steward training session August 18th. The White Oak Tavern in Ellicott City, Maryland will hold a whiskey tasting to benefit that city's flooding victims August 22nd. And the Bourbon Women will take over Louisville's Brown Hotel for their annual Symposium Conference August 24th through the 26th. Right now, we have 186 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a tasting, a festival, or other whiskey-related event coming up, just let us know with the contact form at our website, and we'll add it to the list.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. It may be hard to believe, but until this week, the leaders of the 9 major whiskey trade associations around the world had never come together for a joint meeting. If there is one benefit from the global trade conflict, the Spirit of Collaboration Summit in Louisville might just be it, as the self-proclaimed W9 are already talking about another meeting next year. The dispute between the U.S. and many of its key trading partners has turned whiskey into a trade weapon, with Canada, the European Union, China, Mexico, and Turkey imposing import tariffs on bourbon and other American-made whiskeys to retaliate for U.S. tariffs on their steel and aluminum exports to America. Kentucky Distillers Association President Eric Gregory invited his colleagues to Louisville for the summit, as those tariffs threaten to undermine the continued growth of the whiskey business.
Since the U.S. and the EU eliminated tariffs on most spirits from other WTO members in 1997, American whiskey exports to the EU increased more than fourfold to $667 million, and America's whiskey imports from the EU increased nearly fourfold to $1.7 billion as well. Similarly, after NAFTA came into place in 1995, U.S. whiskey exports to Canada grew 12 times from $4 million to $49 million, and Canada's whiskey exports to the U.S. now stand around $275 million. The bottom line, the world whiskey market is large and it's growing, and we all drink one another's whiskey.
In addition to the KDA, the summit included the Distilled Spirits Council, the American Craft Spirits Association, and the President's Forum from the U.S., along with Spirits Canada, the Scotch Whisky Association, Spirits Europe, the Irish Whisky and Spirits Association, and the Japan Spirits and Liqueurs Producers Association. Japan is the one country with tariffs on its steel and aluminum exports to the U.S. that has not retaliated against American whiskeys. But the association's Jun Tanaka says that could change if the Trump administration escalates the conflict.
I think our government is trying to persuade the U.S. government in a quiet way, gentleman's manner, but if another things come, for example, to the car, automobile, or the automobile parts for Japanese products, they really think about something retaliating. Yeah. In the case, the symbolic item from U.S. is could be included, could be including bourbon whiskey,
Which would be a major blow for Suntory, which owns Beam, along with Kirin, which owns Four Roses, and the investments that the Japanese have here in the States.
That's correct. And we are the industry of for long-term view, and we secure the employment, and we're very careful the environment and the community investment. So I mean, really pity to have some suffering from that short term of mindsetting. That is my view.
So far, most of the major U.S. producers have been able to keep the impact of punitive tariffs to a minimum by shipping extra spirits in advance. But as with many trade wars, it's the little guys who pay the price, according to Margie Lehrman of the American Craft Spirits Association.
If you remember anything I say today, I'd like you to remember ripple. What does that mean? The ripple effect. Our industry impacts so much more than just the distillery and the employees at that particular distillery. Our industry goes to where we kind of all began with George Washington and his distillery, which is in the agricultural community. So if we start with agriculture and that little grain of seed, and we go on from there, and the bottlers and transportation and manufacturing and the graphic artists, it touches so many different levels of what we're doing. We so welcome this conversation today, so that when I get a call from an Iowa distiller who says to me, Margie, my product's on a container ship. The importer just told me that I've got to reduce my prices by at least 15% before they offload it. That has a substantial impact on what that business plan might look like for that next year.
That's just one of many anxious calls Lehrman has received since the trade conflict started earlier this year.
Not even with the tariffs in place, but even before that, Mark, just the threat of some sort of trade war was enough to cut down discussions and any kind of negotiation on a contract. So that's where we started. We're very hopeful that the ones that have already realized a price reduction, and those that have also realized, sorry, this contract is not going anywhere, that turns around pretty quickly, especially in light of what we heard yesterday, which is something positive in terms of real dialogue and discussions moving forward with the EU and the U.S.
Can you give me any specifics on distillers that have been affected among your membership?
Sure. I have one distiller in Ohio who let me know that he will take, expected next year to do about 25% of his volume going to export, and now it's been cut down to 15%. In terms of dollars, that makes a big difference. He didn't say what is not going to happen, but I've talked to others who have said, we were just about to institute these health benefits for employees, might not be able to do so now.
While most of the tariffs on American whiskeys were set at 25%, Canada only imposed a 10% tariff. Not only is Canada one of the largest export markets for American whiskeys, but if the U.S. were to retaliate with a like-for-like tariff, it could decimate Canada's whiskey industry. Jan Westcott heads up Spirits Canada.
We worked hard to try and persuade the government not to include whiskey on this. The thing that we've learned over many, many years, I've been involved in quite a few trade fights in the wine industry, the beer industry, now the spirits industry, is that you never know where they're going to go, and there's all kinds of collateral damage. And industries that have nothing to do with the issue at play get damaged. And it hurts consumers, it hurts people, it's just bad all around, and it costs people jobs. So far, Canada, took a relatively measured approach. The tariffs that were put on American whiskey were 10%, as opposed to higher in other places. So I think we had some success in moderating that.
Canada's tariffs went into effect on July 1st, but Westcott says whiskey makers and consumers have not yet begun to feel the impact. That will change starting this week.
To be perfectly honest, it won't be until August the 1st that we'll begin to see the impact of this. Most of the governments in Canada said, okay, it's all new things coming across the border, so people probably had 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks of inventory in the country, so it'll be a little bit of a delayed impact that we see. I think everybody's keeping their fingers crossed, hoping that it won't last very long. If you have a belief that it will be short-term, I think suppliers may look at that and say, okay, we'll help offset the cost of that. We want to keep our customers, we want to be fair to them, but if it goes on a long time, your ability to do that. So it could have very significant impacts.
Tariffs are nothing new to the whiskey industry. While many countries have reduced or eliminated them through free trade agreements in recent years, other countries still have tariffs in place to protect their domestic spirits producers. Sarah Dixon of the Scotch Whisky Association represented Spirits Europe at the briefing following the summit, while the group's leaders took part via Skype from Europe.
What's really great about this meeting is the fact that we can talk as a whisky family, as a spirits family, about how we tackle barriers where we see them coming up.
The joint resolution the associations signed after the summit calls on world leaders to de-escalate their disputes and return to free and fair trade. While it may fall on deaf ears at the White House, the KDA's Eric Gregory sees a lot of positives.
I've been texting with Congressman Barr out of Lexington all day today. He was very happy to see us doing this. We talked to Senator Leader McConnell's office, and they were happy to see that this group is getting together. So I think we'll have a good reception when we present this to our elected officials.
So are you happy with the way the summit worked out?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was a good sign when we all met last night and got talking, and people were already talking about where to have the summit next year. So it was a great open dialogue this morning. We went around the table and talked about how it's, what we're seeing in each one of our countries and ways that we can work together with a unified voice. And people were really happy, I think, just to be together.
As for a summit in 2019, the early betting is on a gathering in Ireland. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the classic Lagavulin 16-year-old, the Distiller's Edition, and the throwback 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Let's start off with the Glenfiddich Fire and Cane Edition that we heard about during the news. It's bottled at 43% ABV, and the nose has a subtle peatiness with toffee, nougat, molasses, and muted spices. The taste is smoky and woody with campfire smoke, honey, molasses, and a touch of allspice. The finish has a lingering touch of campfire smoke, along with hints of molasses, brown sugar, and touches of allspice, vanilla, and nutmeg that add some complexity. I'm scoring the Glenfiddich Fire and Cane Edition a 93. Next up, Wild Turkey's Master's Keep 1894 bourbon. What's that? You never heard about that one? Well, that's because Eddie Russell picked it exclusively for sale in Australia. It's bottled at 45% ABV, and the nose has notes of caramel candy and cocoa, along with hot fudge, ice cream topping, vanilla, and hints of honey and oak. The taste is spicy and intense with black peppercorns and a hint of chili powder that fade to reveal caramel, honey, and just a hint of molasses. The finish is very long with lingering spices and hints of vanilla and honey. I'm scoring the Wild Turkey Master's Keep 1894 bourbon a 94. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Proud to announce the 2018 edition of Parker's Heritage Collection. This year's edition carries on Parker Beam's legacy of excellence and innovation with a unique bourbon finished in orange Curacao barrels that accent the bourbon's own natural hints of citrus. Once again, sales of this year's edition of the Parker's Heritage Collection will benefit the ALS Association. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Thursday afternoon, I was walking back to my hotel in downtown Louisville after the W9 Summit and stopped at the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience just a couple of blocks down Whiskey Row from the Fraser History Museum. There's a new bar on the third floor of the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience, and I bought a dram of the Evan Williams Masters Blend. This is a limited bottling that blends the standard Evan Williams bourbon with some of the 1783 edition, the Bottled in Bond, and the Evan Williams 23-year-old bourbon. It's bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has notes of vanilla, caramel, honey, and orange pekoe tea. The taste is complex and spicy with a good mouthfeel and touches of cinnamon and black pepper, along with orange pekoe tea and hints of caramel and vanilla. The finish is long with lingering spices and a good balance of sweeter notes underneath. A bit of water opens up the flavor with hints of straw and dried flowers, while amping up the spices too. I'm scoring the Evan Williams Masters Blend Bourbon a 93. And finally, let's look at the W.L. Weller Special Reserve Wheated Bourbon. It's also bottled at 45% ABV. The nose is soft, warm, and sweet with notes of caramel candy, chocolate fudge, vanilla, and a hint of oak. The taste starts off muted and sweet, followed by a good burst of cinnamon candies that fades to reveal honey, caramel, creme brulee, and just a hint of oak. The finish is long and gentle, with subtle spices and a nice touch of caramel. Water intensifies the honey sweetness at first, along with adding a hint of straw and settling down the cinnamon spices. I'm scoring the W.L. Weller Special Reserve Wheated Bourbon a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,200 different whiskeys at WhiskyCast.com.
This is whiskey. Johnnie Walker Scotch whisky. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're alright, lassie.
Which looks like this, as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Put the bloody game on the telly, Ella.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnnie Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnnie Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whisky. 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
We have a brand new episode of the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast out now. In between Tales of the Cocktail last week and the W9 Summit in Louisville, we were at the Podcast Movement 2018 conference in Philadelphia and put together a panel of podcasters to taste some rye whiskeys. Why not? Elsie Escobar, Mike Joachim, Sean McCready, and longtime WhiskyCast listener and lawyer to the nearly famous Chris Lero tasted the Pikesville Rye, Old Overholt Bottled in Bond, and High West's 2018 edition of Yippee-Ki-Yay Rye. The WhiskyCast tasting panel is presented by the Whiskey Exchange. You'll find it wherever you get your podcasts and at whiskycast.com. Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. As I mentioned, I've been on the road for the last 10 days or so between Tales of the Cocktail in New Orleans, Podcast Movement 2018, and that quick trip to Louisville for the summit, but managed to stay active on social media the whole time, and that's a good thing. I found this urgent message from @Yoursot in Belgium on Twitter. Sorry to bother, but I got a question. A friend is in Edinburgh with no advanced warning. She asks if I want a whiskey, but she knows nothing about it. Do you happen to know a more commonly available whiskey in that city, akin to Islay style, Lagavulin, Kalila, etc.? Well, I suggested that they have her check in at the Scotch Whisky Experience shop or Royal Mile Whiskies just down the Royal Mile to see what they might have that's out of the ordinary. And that's just what they did. As Yoursot put it, Glenfarclas 105. It'll be my first Glenfarclas, shame, and a return to Speyside after quite some bottles. She also got tasters for the 15 and 21-year-old, I believe. She scored me one of the best cask-strength whiskeys available, citing our tasting notes at whiskycast.com, and looking forward to it. Thanks for all the help. Our pleasure, though I'm not sure what Glenfarclas has to do with Islay style, but hope you enjoy it. Now, last time around, I mentioned a tweet from Matt Baglol at Dr. Matt Dreamboat on Twitter, and apparently that made his day. He tweeted out, "Can you imagine my thrill when I was listening to WhiskyCast this morning and Mark mentioned one of my silly tweets, and he pronounced my name correctly. Great start to the week. Thanks kindly, Mark. #Scotch, #Whiskey, #Industry Insider." Matt, glad to help, but we haven't even addressed the issue of that Dr. Matt Dreamboat Twitter handle yet, though. Finally, I owe an apology to Noah Rothbaum and David Wondrich, the winners of the Spirited Award last week at Tales of the Cocktail for the best podcast, online video, or broadcast series. When I announced that award, I called their Daily Beast podcast series Life Without Bars. It is actually Life Behind Bars. Life Without Bars is one of the groups that received a Tales of the Cocktail Foundation grant last week to support its work helping women re-enter society after serving time in prison. And it was an inadvertent error on my part. Sorry, guys. And once again, congratulations. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. You can also connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. And let's close things out now with Behind the Label, our look at the science, history, and other things that make whiskey unique. During the news, I mentioned Highland Park's new travel retail range of single malts that's being launched this month. Creating a new lineup of whiskeys is not as simple as you might think, and this new lineup has been in the works for more than a year now. Back in April of last year, I sat down with Highland Park brand director Jason Craig in Denmark as the brand was launching its Valkyrie single malt, along with a major redesign of the bottles for the Highland Park domestic range. At the time, the Warrior series of Sven, Harold, and Einar single malts had been on travel retail shelves for several years. Even though there were no age statements on the whiskies, they were already showing their age. and Jason Craig was working with his team on an update.
When you have refreshed your core domestic range, the packaging, execution and travel retail doesn't match now to our domestic range. So it's less of a dramatic change. It'll be taking a lot of the stuff we've done domestically and applying that to the travel retail range. Will some of the ages come back into travel retail? May well be the case. Yes, we're looking at that just now. Names will change, stories will change. Yes, absolutely. But we're trying to keep travel retail as a link to our domestic. So you have to see the product in the domestic market, go to travel retail and say, that's the same family, but it's slightly different. Oh, I'll try one of those. That's what we're going to do. That'll be early 2018.
Highland Park whiskey maker Gordon Motion has to take all of the ideas that come out of Edrington's headquarters in Glasgow and create the whiskies to match. We talked recently while he was at the distillery up on Orkney.
Or the feedback we were getting was certainly from the markets. You've got a very limited time to speak to people as they're rushing through an airport, and trying to get express the differences between Sveinainen and Harald was difficult in the time you had available. So they wanted something, a very simple message to convey to the consumer as they're passing. So that actually gave me a good and easy brief for producing these. They wanted a smoky one, a sweet one, a spicy one. And then the whole thing would be rounded off with the 18-year-old Viking Pride at a higher strength, and that is sort of all-rounder. So Spirit of the Bear was the smoky one. Now, a number of, as you probably know, we produce our own malted barley at the distillery, and it's heavily peated, but that's usually mixed in around 20% of the malt. So 80% would be unpeated, 20% is peated. And that's our usual style of Highland Park. Now, a number of years ago, we experimented with, what would happen if we put in 100% Highland Park produced malt. So we've been laying that down for a number of years, and we've now got sort of reasonable quantities of a heavily peated variety of Highland Park, or heavily peated for Highland Park. It's probably not up in the Ardbeg or the Islay styles, but it's relatively heavily peated. So we've started to use some of that heavily peated malt in some of our products, and this has gone into Spirit of the Bear. So Spirit of the Bear is, we don't declare an age on it. It's the starter, and it's the heavily peated style. So really pulling from this 100% Highland Park malted barley that we've used in the New Make Spirit a number of years ago. The second one, Loyalty of the Wolf, is a 14-year-old. This is the sweet one. So again, we're looking at a mixture of the sweeter styles of casks that we have maturing, principally but not exclusively American oak, and it's a mixture of bourbon and sherry casks to give us that sweeter vanilla character. And the Wings of the Eagle is a 16-year-old, and that's the spicy one. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we're going on towards the sort of spicy, smoky notes from Highland Park, and also using European oak sherry casks in that, just to give us that sort of dark, spicy note. And then the range will be rounded off with the 18-year-old Viking Pride, which is the similar to available in domestic markets, but at a higher strength. And that's just the nicely balanced one, sweet, smoke, and spicy all together.
What's that one going to be bottled at, strength-wise?
Oh, you keep asking me all these difficult questions.
That's sort of my job, Gordon.
Yeah, I know. I should know these things off the top of my head. 46.0%.
Okay, what's the regular bottled at, 43 or?
43, yeah.
Okay. So that still leaves the 18-year-old cask strength for the distillery, right?
Yeah.
How hard was it to come up with the three different profiles once you had that brief? Was it fairly easy at that point?
Yeah, it was easier. Having a good brief like that goes, right, well, I know the direction I've got to go here. I know what I'm going to play about with. So, yeah, you maybe have 4 or 5 versions of each one until you're happy with the style you've got. But, yeah, rather than just saying, well, you've got a completely open brief, where do I go now? It was a lot more straightforward this time. So, yeah, maybe a few attempts for each one, the main thing is being able to make sure that it's very easy to create a one-off, but being able to do that next year and the year after that and the year after that to create something that's going to be going for the next, who knows how many years, and ensuring you've got the amount of stock available to you. That's where the real challenge comes in, because we never specifically laid down stock for these variants.
So you have to juggle things a little bit, work with Keith and the guys in the warehouse, right?
Yeah, I mean, looking at the stock, the casks we've got available to us over the next few years and saying, right, okay, so if I may want to make it of this style, but actually in year 3 I can't because I don't have enough casks, so I maybe need to temper it. So, that's a big part of the job. It's just looking at the future and seeing, can we continue to do this?
The process of creating a new whiskey ranges from company to company, but it's not unusual for a team to spend a couple of years on a project. For instance, when Diageo sold off Bushmills to Casa Cuervo back in late 2014, the impression at the time was that Diageo was getting out of the Irish whiskey business. What no one outside the company knew at the time was that Diageo's blenders were already working on what would become the Rowan Company Irish whiskey that was released in the spring of 2017, and that Diageo planned to convert the old power station at the Guinness St. James's Gate complex in Dublin into a distillery. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. That's also where you'll find links for the new episode of the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD videos, along with the latest whiskey news, events, cocktail recipes, and a whole lot more, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes. If you haven't done it already, I hope you'll take just a minute this week and please leave a review or rating for WhiskyCast wherever you get your podcasts from. Those reviews and ratings do figure into search results that help other whiskey lovers discover WhiskyCast when they're looking for podcasts. Our cask strength conversation continues all week long online. You'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is Whisky, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whisky. From this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you twice each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.